Well, thanks a lot for coming out tonight, y'all. So I too, by the way, feel free to look at this. Feel free, you're more than welcome to watch that. So I too would like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded and occupied territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh, and to acknowledge their generosity and hospitality in hosting us here. And I would also like to make mention of Andrea. Andrea, could you wave just for a second? That's Andrea. That's Fiorella over there. Mark and Jean, who are doing the tech. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name, sir, back there. And Paul, too. But thank you for doing the tech. And to Amarjad, who is not here, but is consistently putting on great events here. So can we give those two guys in particular a little hand just right now? Thank you. Good. Thanks, you guys, for all the help. I was a pain in the ass getting this set up today. So. And I would also like to add one more little bit in here, which is that I'm super grateful for the opportunity to speak in this building and in this space. And I have spoken, for those of you that have seen me here speak in previous times, that I've spoken about the sheer awfulness of Goldcorp, to which the name of this facility has been handed. And so I'm not going to do that again exactly now. But I would like to, just for a second, I would like to mention the sheer awfulness of Kinder Morgan. And I'd like to acknowledge the great work that many people involved in this facility, SFU students and SFU faculty included, who are under the threat of a disastrous lawsuit for Kinder Morgan. And as I rode down here today in the crushing rain, I thought of the people up on Burnaby Mountain who are doing good work for all of us, and I'd like to think that maybe we'll have all of us will have an opportunity to support them one way or another sooner rather than later. So my thanks to them and to all those folks who are doing good work for us, in particular, in this context, the SFU folks who are doing that work for us. And finally, I would say thanks to you guys showing up in the pouring rain on a Thursday night to talk about sports is might be the last freaking thing many of you actually really want to do. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you very kindly coming out and doing that with me tonight. So thanks for your generosity in advance. And I'm going to make an argument to you. I'm going to make an argument to you tonight about the possibility of the sporting world. I'm not going to defend the full length and breadth of the sporting world as it exists now. That obviously would be a futile proposition. But I am going to make an argument to you about what it is, about what it could be, what it should be, what it might be. And I'm going to suggest to you that sports and the sporting world are a site of radical possibility. And I don't mean that in an instrumentalized way. I mean that in an everyday lived and political sense, in an idea, in the context of struggle. And so I'm not asking you to like sports or to like the idea of the sporting world. But I am going to ask you, I'm going to submit to you that you might want to care, to respect them, to take the sporting world seriously. And to take it seriously as a future, as a possible, as an existing site of struggle and of liberation and of lasting value. So that's the argument I'm going to make tonight. And a lot of that argument is going to be based around ideas of materiality. The idea of stuff, of material, physical being in the everyday here and now. And to get us off on the right foot for this evening tonight, I'm going to ask you to do a number of small favors for me. These small favors will not go unrewarded, I can promise you. But just work with me here, if you would, for a second. The first thing I'd like you to do right now is if you could stand up for half a second. If everybody can stand up, if you would, please. And if you could turn to somebody nearby you who you don't recognize, shake their hand and introduce yourself to them, please. All right, so I'm going to make an argument here to you, and I think it's a decent place to start, which is to say that intellectuals of all kinds, progressives, leftists, radicals, have habitually reviled and condescended to sports. And for good reason. for all kinds of good reasons. And you can think of those reasons off the top of your head right away. You can think about homophobia. You can think about racialization. You can think about vicious misogyny. You can think about awful corporatism. You can think of, there's any number of reasons that all of you may, I'm sure you can think of immediately why you would revile sports and want to have nothing to do with them. And I'm going to make an argument that that condescension is justified in many ways. But I'm going to make an initial submission to you that, in fact, capitalism has maimed everything in its path. What sector of our lives, of our culture, of our world has capitalism not distorted? Sports right along with it. And I want to suggest to you that hating on sports, reviling sports, condescending sports, may in fact be barking up the wrong tree. And I will suggest to you further that there is something about the sporting world, there's something about sports that all the craziness around sports can't exactly extinguish. So many of us love and care about sports, but feel somewhat chagrined or ashamed. Maybe like it's something that we have to hide a little bit. Maybe it's something that we're not exactly proud of. But I'm going to submit to you again that there is something incredibly important, something incredibly powerful about sports that we condescend to, that we ignore at our peril. And I think that the left largely dismisses sport as illegitimate, as symptomatic or indicative of a broader malaise. And I think that condescension from the left towards sports and sporting activities actually speaks more to the larger failings of the Anglo-American left than it does to the failings of sports. And I think that the left's general predilection to abandon the sporting world has allowed the political right, in the broadest sense of the word, to rush in and inculcate our sporting lives with the worst of values, of militarism, of patriotism, of misogyny, of racialization, etc. And I think that there is something in the world of sports that is so worthy of love and care, of respect and struggle, and is so full of possibilities for the common good that I think that we should consider fighting for it. It's my first argument to you. I'm going to direct your attention over here just for a second, as I'm going to do a couple times. And I'm going to play a short video here of Brittany Griner. She'll explain who she is.
ESPN Insider, your way in.
And here's what Brittany Griner said to USA Today. My parents didn't know at the time. It hadn't come out completely. It was kind of like, I just hadn't said it. My dad and my mom have always told me, be who you are. At the time, and she was laughing as she said this, they probably weren't sure what I was interpreting that as, end quote. ESPN's Jamel Hill joins us now. And Jamel, I know you're writing a column for ESPN.com about this very topic as we speak. I know you were on First Take earlier today doing your podcast. This is a hot topic, but Brittany Griner says she has talked about her sexuality before, but as far as we know, this is the first time she has done so publicly. And as we saw from that soundbite, she's very much at ease talking about it. No one really seems to be making that big of a deal of it. Why do you think it is such a big deal in men's sports, men's professional sports in particular, with male athletes coming out versus female athletes, where this is just Brittany and she's just talking?
First, let me say what she did was really significant, and people should make a big deal out of it, just from the sense that you have an athlete in a prominent position, and you could argue that in college basketball, she was the biggest star of the year. And I like the ease in which she said it. She was very comfortable. It wasn't a lot of, ta-da, or it was just, this is who I am. This is who I've always been encouraged to be. And I think that sends such a strong message to young people. We've read the accounts of young people being bullied about their sexuality.
Great. So let's just pause that there for a second. That's Brittany Griner, who was the biggest star in women's basketball at the NCAA level for about 4 years. And as the video, as they talk about the video, she came out. But she came out in a very casual way. She came out in a very relaxed way. She just kind of talked about it, and it was really, in fact, really not that big a deal. In part because women's sports, there's a long tradition of queer women athletes, from Martina Navratilova on, et cetera, et cetera. You want me to talk in the microphone? Sorry. Apologies. Sorry, buddy. So there's a long history, and as Jamali Hill on ESPN is talking about, then what about male athletes? How important the Brittany Griner example is, and how important it is for male athletes to replicate that. So let's have a quick look at this. This here is a video of Michael Sam, who many of you might be familiar with. Michael Sam is was the first professional male football player to publicly announce that he's gay. And Michael Sam came out. He was the SEC Co-Defensive Player of the Year, which is a really big deal. Typically a player of his stature would get drafted early in the NFL draft. He did not get drafted early. He did not get drafted on the first day. In fact, he lasted almost to the very last pick of the draft in the 7th round. But this is him on ESPN, live television, finding out that he got drafted. And he got drafted by the St. Louis Rams, who released him, and then he got picked up by the Dallas Cowboys, who have since released him. Nevertheless, this is the live coverage of him getting selected. And can we get a bit more volume there, bud?
12 wins, which they had never had before.
Good.
Okay, as we told you, this is the moment where Michael Sam got the news that he is going to be a member of the St. Louis Rams.
Oh, no. So I need to stop that for a second. How do I get back there? I can't see the screen over here. Sorry, dudes. Oh, thank you.
On the phone, and there you see the raw emotion. We've seen this so many times over and over again for so many players.
So this is common. They often have for big-time players, they have a film on them, they cry. But this is him and his boyfriend.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Through our working with the ESPYs and the Arthur Ashe Courage Award that he's receiving at the ESPYs, a little smashing of the cake in the face, and it's a good time all the way around. And for Michael Sam, there you get the opportunity to go live on a lifelong.
So, it's a sweet scene. It's a scene that's replicated over and over again for a decade or two. Same thing, big-time prospects. They get selected, they cry, they kiss somebody, their mom, they high-five their dad, they hug people. Except this example is something entirely new and entirely kind of wonderful. ESPN and live television and an interracial couple, an interracial same-sex couple kissing repeatedly. And it was a topic of incredible conversation on ESPN, but also on virtually every other North American news outlet for a good couple of weeks about it. And the consensus, the overwhelming consensus on it, is that Michael Sam will in fact be welcomed or the next gay athlete will be welcomed into an NFL locker room. And I would say that just those two brief examples there, Brittany Griner and Michael Sam, are two examples of sports really very viscerally, very publicly, very openly being on the leading edge of queer and gay rights visibility and acceptance. Two very interesting examples. Problematic, there's lots of kinds of problematic kind of discourses and threads, but two very interesting and very profound kind of moments. And in fact, I would argue, in the world of queer visibility, two really important moments that could only have happened in this way, in this kind of style, in the sporting arena. So there's something there that I just want to draw your attention to, and I'm not exactly sure how to name it right yet, except to say that there is something there and there is something important. And let me just hold on just for a second. So in the, just for a second, I'm going to give you guys a ball. Just to hold on to it. Sarah, don't throw the ball away. Don't throw these balls, okay? Just hold on to it. Not to do it because the tank guys are going to throw me and knock stuff over. Just pass those around. Everybody, I don't know if this is my ball. I'm just going to reach in the balls around everybody. Hold on to them, but feel free to the other. I'm going to ask you to jump in a second. So just hold on to those. So that's my first submission. And I think I've presented a little tiny bit of evidence about the potential power of sports. But obviously that's going to be a tough sell to you. And it's a tough sell for anyone who's ever gone to a game, a big-time pro game. It's anybody who's ever encountered the a-hole jocks in your school hallway. It's anybody who's ever listened to one more ugly, racist, homophobic chant. It's anytime you hear a story of one more pack of rapist football players. It's anybody that's been barraged by the corporate insanity of a sporting arena. It's anybody who's been stuck in traffic coming out of a game. It's anybody who's ever found themselves in the mindless hysteria of sports bars. And you're like, well, okay, so what's this? What is this argument exactly? And I think that the argument I want to make is around particularity. That there is something particular about the kind of space that sports opens up. And it opens up a certain kind of space, not just for social change and social movements, but it opens up space for a particular set of conversations between particular sets of people that may or may not be available to us otherwise. If I can draw your attention up here just for a second. Think about, I'm not going to talk, these are going to be, the names are not going to be in sync with the players here, but think about Jesse Owens crushing the myth of racial superiority in front of Hitler. Think about Joe Louis. Through much of the early years of the 20th century, thousands and thousands of people would flock to the streets every time Joe Louis fought. Think about Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion. Think about Jackie Robinson. Think about Roberto Clemente. Think about Muhammad Ali, or Billie Jean King, or Magic Johnson. Think about what Magic Johnson has done for conversations around HIV/AIDS in this part of the world. Think about Martina Navratilova or Jason Collins. Think about Jim Thorpe, by many accounts, the greatest athlete of our time, an indigenous guy from Oklahoma. Think about Wilma Rudolph or the Williams sisters or Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf or Holly Mangold or Renee Richards or so many of these folks up here. Think about all these folks that have found themselves as particular kinds of flashpoints. And think about as well, if you can draw your attention to decades of transformative, transcendent moments in social history. In challenging and moving ahead more equitable racialized discourses, conversations about race and gender, sexuality, and places where people are able to talk and argue and contend in ways that are not available otherwise. And think about all the times those conversations have found themselves focused around sports, around athletes, and around sporting events. Think about the kinds of conversations that sports opens up for people that otherwise would never have those kind of conversations with each other. Try this one, for example.
Turn to football Sunday. The NFL is now 8 weeks into its season, and pressure continues to mount on the Washington Redskins to change their name, which many consider racist. This week, there's a big meeting between the NFL and an angry tribal nation, and ABC's Marcy Gonzalez is on the story. Good morning, Marcy.
Good morning, Bianna. Even President Obama has weighed in, saying he thinks the name should be changed. But the decision lies in the team owner's hands, and this morning, he isn't budging. Overnight, Washington Redskins owner Dan Snyder was welcomed to a team rally by fans warmly singing the NFL franchise's fight song, Hail to the Redskins. Hail to the Redskins! But next week, senior league officials will welcome leaders of the Oneida Tribal Nation to discuss the growing controversy surrounding Snyder's apparent refusal to even consider changing what the Oneida call a racist and offensive team name.
Our Indian tribal nation wants the NFL to be on the right side of history in the fight against racism.
After tribal leaders first requested a meeting with league officials in early October, Redskins owner Dan Snyder issued a letter to fans, calling the name part of the football football team's heritage. He writes, "I respect the feelings of those who are offended by the team name, but I hope such individuals also try to respect what the name means."
So I have had conversations about that particular issue, about the Redskins logo and the Redskins team name, but among other team names, with people in places and in ways that I don't think I would ever really have the reason or the capacity or the focal point or the threshold to engage with. It's a really interesting set of conversations, and there's lots of people that will tell you there's nothing wrong with it. There's all kinds of indigenous names that are used for sports events and sports teams and sports mascots, And then you start talking about it and thinking about it a little bit, and you start unwinding. You say, okay, maybe that is true. Maybe that is, in fact, an honoring thing. So, and then you start saying, well, what if then, if, for example, I'm going to start a new sports team, and I think I might be calling it like the Baltimore Blackskins, for example. And even saying that feels, on screen, on being taped saying that, sounds awful and awkward. And it opens up a set of conversations and a set of possibilities to talk about racism, to talk about indigeneity, to talk about appropriation in ways that I think are particularly kind of useful. Let me give you another example here. Let me give you an example of Ray Rice. This is an event that many of you may have heard of. Oh my goodness, I lost my thing again here. No, I can do it this way. Ray Rice, those of you that are familiar, is a football player for the Baltimore Ravens. He's a famous and well-known football player. He's a star running back. And he's famous in lots of ways because he's often been talked about as a good guy, as a guy who kind of does community work and that kind of stuff. And this year, he was in an elevator in Vegas, and he got filmed coming out of the elevator, dragging his unconscious wife out of the elevator. And the NFL investigated and said, well, we didn't know what happened in the elevator. And they suspended him for 2 games. And then there was a sort of a hue and cry about it, and people said, well, hold on for a second. I mean, that's a despicable piece of violence. And then eventually the other video, the video from inside the elevator came out, and it showed, I'm not going to show it here, but it showed him essentially punching his wife full on in the face and knocking her out cold for several minutes. The NFL then backtracked and suspended him indefinitely. And it's turned into a gigantic, huge kind of mess where people are asking, well, when did the NFL know it? What did they know about it? Who's lying, et cetera? But buried within that is a national conversation about domestic violence that has crossed all kinds of borders in all kinds of ways. And so I went down to the Seahawks game this past Sunday. And right in the middle of the Seahawks game, there's a huge Jumbotron or whatever, and there's a message that piles up on the Jumbotron in front of 68,000 rabid, mostly drunk football fans saying, I can't remember exactly the tagline, but it was something like, no to domestic violence. Everybody speak up. It's time now to speak up. And there's football player after football player after football player on a Jumbotron saying it's time to speak up against domestic violence. I don't know exactly what that means, but I would suggest to you that it means something. Try this.
NFL's attitude toward domestic violence in the wake of the Ray Rice video.
You have to listen carefully, apparently.
Shocking as that video was for the American public, it was
Can you crank that?
shocking for those who know
Thanks, man.
Rice and his wife Janae. Rice is not Floyd Mayweather. He had no public history of abuse of any kind. In fact, he was known as one of the NFL's good guys. So I now want to bring in 2 of Rice's former Ravens teammates. Chris Johnson won a Super Bowl with Ray Rice less than 2 years ago, and Derek Mason was one of the players who helped mentor Rice when Rice first came into the league. And Derek, the guy you know is not the guy you'd expect to be knocking his wife unconscious in an elevator. So how do you reconcile that?
You can't. It's a guy that you, at least myself, spent 4 or 5 years with, and to see this on a video is shocking.
Yeah, that is what's amazing, is that people sometimes find it hard to believe, oh, this guy I know could do that, but that's usually how this goes. I mean, Chris, your personal story is just heart-wrenching. For people who don't know, your own sister was a victim of domestic abuse. She was shot to death by her ex-boyfriend. Yet you and your wife have been friends of Ray and Janae Rice for years, so what has this been like for you?
Well, it was kind of a touchy feeling when I first seen the video, but I think in Ray's defense, it was a good guy that did something terribly bad that now that he's paying the consequences for.
I mean, you stood up in the Ravens locker.
I want to pause it there. Again, a awful, horrific situation. The Ray Rice situation is in about 4 different ways. But it has instigated a conversation about domestic violence in ways that I haven't encountered, or at least I don't remember encountering at that scope, at that scale in my lifetime. I want to offer you one more video to make my case. Let's try this one. This is a bit of a trickier story. This guy here is Brian Burke, this dude here. And this is okay, there's Brian Burke. You'll get him in a second. Brian Burke is that's him there. Hey, what do you know? There's Brian Burke there. Brian Burke is one of the silverbacks of the NHL. He used to be he was the general manager of the Anaheim Ducks when they won the Stanley Cup. And then he was, many of you remember him here as the president and general manager of the Vancouver Canucks. And then he was the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs when he made this video. Now he's in a similar role with Calgary. But he's the epitome of big, tough, gruff, tough-talking, old-school hockey guy who constantly talks about how he wants his teams to be full of truculence. He wants them to fight. He wants them to play a man's game. He has everything that you might loathe about hockey. About 5 years ago, when he was working for Toronto, his son came out. And his son was a terrific 19-year-old hockey, or I guess 17, 18-year-old hockey player who quit his high school team because he was uncomfortable being in a locker room and he wasn't sure how his teammates would take it. So he quit playing hockey, and then he went to college and decided he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become part of the hockey world. And he was the assistant manager, the equipment manager. He had some kind of managerial role with Miami of Ohio's college hockey team. And he came out. And he came out, so it's not a huge deal, but it was a huge deal because he was Brian Burke's son. And Brian Burke reacted immediately with incredible amounts of truculence, incredible amounts of brashness, incredible amounts of arrogance in support of his son. Let me give you a quick call of this.
Manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs is with us. We're going to give you a one-night reprieve about talking about your hockey team, because also with us tonight is Brendan Burke, Brian's son, who joins us live from Boston. Brendan's a former hockey player. He's currently a student manager with the Miami University hockey team, the #1 ranked team in the NCAA. 2 years ago, Brendan went to his family and told them for the first time that he is gay. Brendan, I want to take you back to that night. You told your father last, after everybody else in your family. Why'd you do that? How difficult was it?
Honestly, I mean, the timing was not really planned. I knew that I wanted to come out at Christmas of that year, and we just happened that we saw our dad. We went and visited him on the West Coast. He was working for Anaheim then, so we just happened to see him later than I saw the rest of my family. So it wasn't planned. I was all right telling him. It was nerve-wracking like it is anytime you tell a family member, but I knew my dad would support me just like I knew the rest of my family was going to support me, and it meant a lot. But no, the timing wasn't planned. It just happened. That's when I saw him.
Were you surprised?
It was important to me that no, I wasn't.
So, yeah, no problem. I was just going to ask your father if he was surprised.
I was surprised, but you know, Brendan's a wonderful kid. He's been a joy since the day he came home from the hospital, and I support him. I'm very proud of him.
What did you say to him that night?
Well, I said it won't change anything, Brendan. You know, it doesn't change our view of we love you, we're proud of you, and it doesn't change anything in my mind, and it never will.
And Brendan, what did that mean?
So I'm just going to pause that there. And it goes on, but remains the same. He's got this idiot style where he always he's got his tie undone. He's always threatened to fight people. He's a jerk in a lot of ways, but he's pugnacious in support of it. And they ask him, they say, they said, do you think a gay player or a gay executive will be welcome in the NHL? And he just looks at the camera. He looks like he's going to drop the gloves right there. And he says, they are welcome in the Toronto Maple Leafs organization. And you're like, whoa, okay. And it's a really interesting story. And so I actually liked him a lot because I'm amenable to those tough guy bullshit narratives. But I love the guy. And he was marching in the Toronto Pride Parade with his son. He was as vocal and as aggressive as you could be in support of his son. The worst and the freaking awful part of this story is that his son Brendan was killed in a car accident at age 20, driving home in a snowstorm to his Christmas dinner. I watched the videos today for about 45 minutes and cried just straight through the whole thing. And so right after this lovely kid comes out and he's doing all this stuff, and his son, it's a beautiful story, and then his kid gets killed in a freaking car accident. And so Brian Burke, his father, and his older brother, Patrick Burke is an executive with the Boston Bruins, formed this organization called You Can Play. What's that? Oh, it's just up there, sorry. Called You Can Play. And essentially, it's an organization to combat homophobia in sports. And what they've done is they've enrolled a whole ton of NHL hockey players to make short videos, short kind of infomercials that are available all over the place, saying, and the tagline is kind of dumb, but it's, if you can play, you can play. And the argument is that if you can play hockey, if you can shoot, if you can score, if you can fight, you're welcome on my team. I'll just play them for you just for a second here.
General Manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Hello.
Oh, yeah.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming in, and especially for coming in and talking about what's a difficult topic for you. I want to begin by showing a little bit of Brennan's legacy, and that comes to the You Can Play campaign. So let's just take a little bit a look at that. This is you and your son, Patrick.
If you can skate, you can skate. If you can score, you can score. If you can fight, you can fight.
I'm Brian Burke of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I'm Patrick Burke of the Philadelphia Flyers. My brother Brendan fought for tolerance, equality, and gay rights in sports. His message was simple. If you can play, you can play.
If you can play,
you can play.
If you can play, you can play.
Let's just stop there. So these videos, if you ever get a chance to see them, they're available. And essentially there's just one thug after another. One great big, NHL hockey playing star who many people would describe as probably not having a thought in their head, standing in front of the camera. And many of the videos are incredibly articulate. There are actually many people like Zdeno Chara and George Parles and all kinds of guys who you would think of as essentially, Neanderthals, saying really beautiful, really articulate, really thoughtful things about homophobia in sports. And the argument that these guys make, and I haven't spoken to Brian Burke, but I've spoken to Patrick Burke at length about it, is the argument is, and I think it's a correct argument, is that seeing athletes that are famous, seeing athletes that are famous for their toughness, saying that actually being gay has nothing to do with anything of those virtues. Being gay doesn't matter, has no bearing on any of those attributes. And that each of them say, we know that there are gay players, and we hope that some of them come out soon. And it's fantastic. I urge you to have a look at it. The stories and Brian Burke's speaking, he had a press conference right after his son was killed, and it's devastating. You can barely watch it, or I don't know about you, but I can barely watch it. But I think it's actually quite a profound argument in many ways. So, all of that, and I'm sorry to say, that's the end of my introduction. So that gets me to a point, and I hope that you're at least willing to countenance the argument that there is something specific about sports that opens up certain kinds of conversations, certain kinds of possibilities, certain kinds of contentions that are not readily available to us otherwise. And I want to make just a couple of quick arguments about why I think that might be so. Before I do that, though, can everybody just stand up again just for a second? Okay, ready? Here's the big time. Okay, ready? Turn to somebody. Look at them in the eye and chuck them the ball gently. Throw them the ball. Yeah, if they don't have a ball, throw it to them. There you go. Okay, good. Do it again. Find somebody else to throw the ball to. Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Okay, stop for a second. Hang on to the ball. Yeah, I've done this before, and all of a sudden there were just balls flying around like crazy. I was like, whoa, no. Okay, hold on that ball. Okay, sit down again. Or you can stand up. You're all good. So here's the first question, or here's my first submission to you. And I want to make an argument about why I think that why I believe this to be true. And my first argument is that sports should be understood as a creative activity. And I want to play off people like Noam Chomsky and Terry Eagleton and lots of others who have said something, and I'm going to more or less quote Noam Chomsky here. And Noam said something, well, he said, you know what? He said, I was driving home one day and he listened to sports talk radio and this incredible amount of information and knowledge and analysis and thought that people put into sports. And he said, if people would just put their energy and all that kind of creative thinking into something that mattered, we'd live in a lot better country. And I think that's a popular rendition. I think it's a popular kind of intellectualized and leftist opinion that sports are the opiate of the masses and that they're essentially worthless. And I would challenge people who hold that opinion to say, to replace sports with, let's say, painting or music, for example, or theater. Can you imagine saying, I wish people would stop thinking about music all the time and they would really just think about something that really matters? You know, I wish people would stop, just get rid of all this like dance and painting stuff and really just care about something that matters. So I think that the first argument I want to make to you is I want you to think about sports as a creative activity on some kind of continuum with all other kinds of creative activities. And many activists of all kinds in the art world have been fantastic over the last couple of decades about blowing up the idea of what constitutes art. Does carpentry count as art? Does craft count as art? Does sewing count as art? And most thoughtful people thinking about art are saying, well, actually the edges are very blurring. It's very blurry. There's a large kind of continuum of things that we could consider art. And in fact, I would suggest to you, and I've tried to make the argument that in fact sports and arts are commensurate. I don't think that's true. I think what we need to do is I think we need to blow up the idea of what is sports and what is art exactly. I think that we can put them all in a large kind of continuum of creative activity. And I can tell you for me, just for one example, is that I never feel more creative than when I have a basketball in my hand. There's no single time where I feel like I can express myself in particular ways. And I feel like when I play basketball, I'm able to express myself. Well, maybe not so much anymore, but I used to be able to express myself in ways that I was unable to do in other ways. That certain parts of my personality were able to come out. I was able to demonstrate certain kinds of aspects of my character and of my personality and of my subjectivity that I was unable to do otherwise. So I think it's really important then to think of sports as a creative activity, just as we think of dance as a creative activity. And part of that it might be useful then to think about some of those blurry edges. So for example, would we say that golf is a sport or is it a pastime? What about ice dancing? Is that a sport? What about darts or synchronized swimming or hiking or auto racing or rhythmic gymnastics? There's all kinds of activities that are pastimes, activities, maybe sports, maybe artistic endeavors. But what's the difference between, say, Olympic judged competitive ice dancing and highly judged competitive dancing on television? I submit to you, not very much. Those are competitive physical activities that require a whole range of physical capacities. And I think that it actually it makes the argument much easier if we just say, actually, it doesn't really matter what is a sport, what is an art, what is a pastime. In fact, there's a whole range of creative activities, and all of them inherit certain kinds of possibilities, some of which are very ennobling, some of which are trivial, many of which have all kinds of possibilities that we may not particularly understand. But I think that, importantly, sports occupy a critical territory of playfulness and fun. And I think that one of the maybe definitional pieces of what constitutes sports is a certain kind of play. But I think that more than that, and I want to talk just a little bit about the differences then between, and there's a range of activities as well in here between playing a sport, between spectating a sport, between fanning and dorking out. And I've heard this argument again as well that, okay, Matt, you're on that damn sports thing again. Okay, it's fine to play sports. If you want to play sports, that's okay. But watching sports, that's passive and consumptive. I've heard that argument before, and I think it's a BS argument. I think nobody would say that about, say, film. Oh, okay, it's okay if you make film, but watching film is passive. And it's okay to go to the theater, but it's okay to be an actor and perform, but going to the theater is passive and regressive. I think if we consider sports and arts in a large kind of basket of creative activity, I think that there is also a performative continuum between playing, between being a fan, between watching it, and much of that is the appreciation of oftentimes highly skilled, oftentimes beautiful, oftentimes incredibly compelling bodies in action. And I think that there is a huge amount of possibility in the act of watching sports, of spectating, of being a fan. And I think that in many of that, and much of that kind of activity is imagination. It's a very basic kind of activity, which is that you watch somebody who is a beautiful performer, a beautiful tango dancer, and when you're out there thinking, oh, I'm going to look just like he does. You don't, but it's in your head. You're imagining yourself. You're being inspired, and that's true. Of course, for every little hockey player out there, or football player, I desperately thought I was going to grow up to be Lynn Swan or Franco Harris or somebody else, and I wasn't. But part of that was my imagination about expanding the range of possibility and expanding the range of creativities and subjectivities that were available to me. And I think that if we can think about sports in not as art, but as similar to it, as full of imaginative and creative possibilities, that we also then create the grounds and the platforms for particular kinds of experimentations about how we get along with one another. That, in fact, on the field or the ice or on the basketball court or in any other kind of sporting platform, you find many different kinds of people finding different ways to get along. How do you behave with one another? What does it mean to be a teammate? What does it mean to be an opponent? What does it mean to win? What does it mean to lose exactly? How do you compete exactly? What does that look like? What are all the kinds of renditions of solidarity, of community, of cooperation, of competition that are possible? And in many ways, what sports allow us to do from a very young age is to find different ways to get along with each other and to find different configurations and different sets of possibilities that allow us to think about social configuration. Let me give you a very quick quote here and see if you can guess who it is. Everything I know about morality and the obligations of men, I owe it to football. Anybody? Close. Albert Camus. Close. Second. Let me give you one more quote, just see if you can guess who it is. Again, football is the open-aired kingdom of human loyalty. Somebody? Antonio Gramsci. And the notion then is that given these particular creative arenas, particularly creative and social arenas, they allow us to experiment with different kinds of social configurations. That's my first submission about what sport does and how it opens up certain kinds of possibilities. Sports is a creative activity. Here's the second thing. And the second one is a fairly simple argument, which is that sports opens up possibilities for encounters with difference. Nowhere in my life have I spent more intimate time with people who are profoundly not like me. And in much of my life, despite my best efforts, I tend to spend a lot of time with people who are kind of like me, who have similar interests, who have similar ideas. People who might come from different backgrounds, who might come from different racialized backgrounds, people who might be older or younger. But rarely do I encounter a place where I spend time with people who are really not like me, who have very different opinions than me, who believe very differently, who act very differently, who worship very differently. Except when I play sports, when I'm in a locker room, when I'm playing pickup ball, when I'm running around, when I'm in the gym. I end up encountering people who are profoundly different than me, and I have a basis for hanging out with them, for talking with them. Let me give you one little brief example of this and the kinds of, I think, relationships that often get inherited in those kind of sporting environments. So last year, I was doing some jiu-jitsu training. And does anybody know anything about jiu-jitsu here? Jiu-jitsu is an interesting martial art, but it's a submission martial art. There's no striking in it. And because I've had so many concussions, I was quite attracted to no striking. I was like, great. So essentially what you do when you do jiu-jitsu, and it's going to sound funny, but it's true, is you lie on your back, you spread your legs wide, somebody else gets between your legs and kind of humps you. You roll around, you wrap your arms tight around each other's neck, and then when you say, you don't say, do you want to play jiu-jitsu? Someone says, oh, do you want to roll around together? That's the thing you say. and it looks highly sexualized. There's one person with their legs spread, another person between. Your arms wrapped tightly around each other's necks, and you're like just grappling. You're rolling around trying to get each other into submission. Essentially, there's a number of submissions. Some of them are arm bars, some of them are necks and stuff. But you're trying to submit each other. So I'm in a class, and I'm learning how to, I like to fight. I've always fought. I've always boxed. But like I said, I'm interested in learning jiu-jitsu. So I go take a jiu-jitsu class at gym, at Spartacus Gym on the Drive. And, there's a bunch of us there, and there's probably like 15 of us in the small room. And so we get some instruction, and then they pair us off, and then we practice the move. And so I'm 46 years old, and I'm not all that flexible. And I'm like, okay, this is challenging me, right? Because there's a lot of stuff around your hips and a lot of motion around your hips, and a lot of kind of stuff where you're flexible around your neck and shoulders, and I'm none of those things. And the guy, Roy, who's doing the instruction, pairs me off with this gigantic freaking kid. And I'm like, oh yeah, here it goes. And he's probably 21 years old. I don't know his background. I'm going to guess that he might have been Filipino, but I don't know, and I didn't ask. I asked him his name. He grunted at me. And I was like, okay. And he's covered with tattoos, and I don't know any other circumstance by which I'd have a relationship with this guy. And I said, okay, let's go, man. He's like, well, okay, great. And then essentially, so I lie on my back and I spread my legs. He gets on top of me, and we just beat the crap out of each other for half an hour. When I say we beat the crap out of each other, I mean more he beat the crap out of me. I weigh 175 pounds. I'm going to guess he weighed in at 260. He's a lot bigger than me and a lot stronger and a lot younger. And it was a fairly, well, Slyn and family knows that I'd come home like a pile of laundry after this, crawling myself home. But there's one time, and it's quite aggressive, and you have to trust the person that you're wrestling with tremendously, because literally, very literally, and it's quite a prescient danger, is that you could get your neck broken. I mean, among other things, you can get your shoulder torn out, you can get your arm dislocated. It's relatively dangerous. And many of those things, because neither he nor I knew what we were doing particularly, you'd find yourself essentially like mouth to mouth, him lying on top of me or me lying on top of him, trying to get instruction. Okay, what do we do now? Okay, put your arm like this behind that. Okay, great, turn there. And you're just wrapped up in a little ball with this gigantic, incredibly sweaty dude who you don't even know his name. And I was like, okay, and it was great. And at one point, after some time, I got tired. And I was exhausted, and I was hurt, and I was sore. And I was sitting there like on my knees, like sucking wind. And this kid, I literally don't even know his name, even though I wrestled. He came over behind me, And he came behind me, and he just put his his hand on my back and just started rubbing my back in the sweetest, most gentle way, saying, "Are you okay, man? You all right?" And I thought, and I was like, yes, no, fuck, no, I'm not okay. But I was like, where would I ever have that kind of relationship? And in particular, where would I ever have that kind of relationship across difference? What were the circumstances by which I would ever have a viable reason to talk to this kid, whose name I still don't even know, and I literally don't know, even having wrestled with him many times? And where would I have that kind of closeness? What were the circumstances by which I would actually be sitting there, like essentially exhausted with him rubbing my back sweetly? And what were the circumstances by which he would act? I don't know what he's like. Maybe he's really just a sweet, lovely person all the time. I don't know anything about him. But to me, that interaction is particularly valuable. And that's a story that I tell occasionally, in part because it exemplifies a certain kind of kindness and a certain kind of dearness to me. And I think in lots of ways that those conversations become so easy. So I want to see if I can pull that back up here.
Okay, Brian, tell me a little bit more about you.
I'm sorry, can I get some tech assistance here?
This is Patrick's mission.
I don't know why I'm all black here.
But really my
here we go.
role is
Thank you.
Just to help him get some players.
There's something about that. There's a way. There's something that he and I could do together. And I think this is so common in so many sporting activities. You find yourself, and those of you that play hockey will know that all of a sudden you're just sitting there naked with some guy who lives in Coquitlam, and you have no reason to talk to him, except now you do have something to talk to him about. You have some kind of shared activity. And I think that that's useful at an individual level, but it's also important, I think, at a cultural level. Let me play you one more short video here. This is a person that's, I think, a really powerful person. This is Christina Carl. And for almost 15 years, Chris Carl was a regular, everyday, working, highly professional baseball writer out of Chicago. about 10 years ago, Chris transitioned to Christina Carl. And as she now talks, she says, you know, all these dudes that I hung out with and talked baseball and drank beer with and watched sports with and sat around with, they didn't have any problem with it. They were actually, you know, it took them a second, but they said they adapted almost instantaneously. And she said, and I've talked to her at length, and she says, you know, that actually all these sports people that you would think would have absolutely no sensitivity to queer and trans issues were like, whatever, fine, let's talk about baseball. And in part because that shared possibility across differences inherits a set of possibilities that may or may not be possible ever in any other circumstance.
You know, all of my fraternity brothers have all been so totally comfortable with my coming out as trans and you know, like comfortable with me in person, like going to ball games or anything like that. You know, is in part because it's like, no, all of that you knew of me from before is still me. I still like baseball. Gender doesn't, you know, like define whether or not you like baseball or like baseball history or like history or like all of the things that we all liked doing together. I mean, like, I still like doing all of that stuff. I just needed to change this one feature of me. And if that, you know, like just makes me, you know, like one of the girls who likes sports, that makes me one of the girls who likes sports. And you can...
Super interesting story. And Christina Carl is now a full-fledged member of the Baseball Writers Hall of Fame and is a voter for the Hall of Fame herself and is a regular fixture on ESPN. And as far as I can tell, there has been no fuss about it. I talked to her for a couple hours last summer, and she said there was one time one guy said something in a locker room that she thought might have been rude, but then turned, and then it kind of went away and it didn't happen. I'll make of that what you will. One last thing I want to offer to you. This is Castor Semenya. Super interesting, and I'm going to not do this story justice because I'm running a tiny bit short of time. Castor Semenya was a 19-year-old South African woman who took the track and field world by storm a few years ago by winning an international meet by an astounding margin. Soon after, there erupted a whole series of arguments and contentions and essentially just a gigantic shit show about whether or not she was a woman or a man. And there was an unbelievable amount of awful activity, a bunch of awful assertions, a bunch of horrible things that happened to her. But essentially, they submitted her to a whole series of gender tests and sex tests to determine whether or not she was in fact a woman. A phenomenon that, in fact, has been echoed over the years by all kinds of women who have been subjected to gender and sex testing. Just watch this for a second. Let me have a quick comment on this.
The 200 meters, setting a new world record in the process. That smashed the old mark he set at the Beijing Olympics by more than a tenth of a second.
That's Usain Bolt.
Earlier this week, Bolt sprinted to another world record in the 100-meter event. And finally for us tonight, another super fast runner is also making headlines all over the world, but for a very different reason. Castor Semenya is an 18-year-old South African who won a world championship yesterday. But her celebration was short-lived after officials ordered her to undergo a series of tests. As CTV's Los Angeles bureau chief Tom Walters explains, they are looking for proof that South Africa's golden girl is not a boy.
She is a world-class athlete who was unheard of before this summer.
Castor Semenya, who is widening her advantage with every stride now.
And the 18-year-old South African has run straight into a controversy.
There is doubt about the fact that this person is a lady, is a woman.
The embarrassing question giving sports officials a lump in the throat, is the new world champion in the women's 800-meter race really a woman at all?
When I'm racing, I'm thinking about my own race, not thinking about anybody.
Semenya might seem masculine even for an 18-year-old boy.
I can't say I was very relaxed.
And to most eyes, she does not look like a girl. To the point where even fans in her own country are wondering.
If she is a she does look very manly.
If she is a man, well, then she's a man, but I don't think she's a man.
Of course, there's more to this than appearances. There is that massive, overwhelming victory.
Here comes the line, and it's no contest. Caster Semenya is an easy one.
I'm going to cut it off there. There's a lot more to the story. But briefly, they subjected her to a series of gender tests. And this has been happening essentially through the entire length of the Olympic movement. And they've attempted all kinds of renditions of gender and sex tests. First, they just asked people to pull their pants down. And then they started testing hair, and then they started testing testosterone, and then they've tried all kinds of renditions of testing to tell whether or not a person is a man or a woman. And the absolute cold, final scientific reality is that there is no test on Earth that can tell whether or not somebody is a man or a woman. Because sex, like gender, is not a binary. It is a continuum. And there is people at all points on that continuum. And to arbitrarily assign particular characteristics and call that male and that female has no scientific weight at all. And in fact, there are a tremendous number of people who are not sex conforming in all kinds of ways. And in fact, that there are a tremendous number of athletes who in fact don't conform for a wide range of reasons. Some of them testosterone, some of them genitalia, some of them musculature, many reasons. And for a long time, the argument was being that women with high levels of testosterone had an unfair advantage. And the first argument is that, in fact, it doesn't. That's scientifically demonstrated to demonstrate that it is not true that a high level of testosterone gives women any other advantage. But a much more interesting question, I think, in particular for leftists around issues of equity, are that, in fact, sports are all about unfair advantage. Which is to say that we don't argue, we don't go, oh my goodness, Shaquille O'Neal is too big, that's not fair, he shouldn't be allowed to play. Or, oh no, Floyd Mayweather's too fast, or Brittany Griner's too strong. That is what sports is. Sports are about unfair biological advantages being enacted, which is why we love sports, because we love people who do have advantages, are so amazing, are strong, are fast, are quick, have great stamina. And what has become clear is that, in fact, it's a highly gendered activity. Michael Phelps, who is the Olympic swimmer who you know, he has these weird feet and where he kind of have his webs between his toes. He kind of looks like a duck. But it's true, right? Yes, right? Okay, sorry. That's a swimmer there. So he's got these duck things. Let me just give it to me for a second. He's got these kind of weird hands that people go, oh my God, that's why he swims so fast, because he looks like a duck. But nobody says, oh my God, we've got to do testing on him or something. In fact, it's a highly gendered activity, and women's bodies have been subjected to these kinds of intrusions and this kind of entirely unethical questioning for generations. And in fact, is a highly gendered set of differentiations. And sports is about unfair advantage. That is why we adore it so much. And to suggest that Caster Semenya has an unfair advantage is both A, untrue, and B, entirely misleading. Last one. I'm almost there. I think that there's something in here then around collisions that I want to talk about. And this is where I want to talk about materiality. And sorry, I'm just going to get a tiny bit nerdy just for a second here. But many of you know that I speak mostly about cities and about difference and about social movements and particularly about land and property lately. And I think there's a core connection to some ideas around solidarity and around generosity and around friendship that I want to offer. In the book that I'm kind of talking about over here, I talk a certain amount about fighting, in part because I like it and I'm a fight fan. But one of the things that I think is interesting and oftentimes confusing to people is when you see two boxers try to punch each other in the face for 45 minutes. And then what's the first thing that happens when the bell rings? They fall into each other's arms, hug and kiss each other, and ask each other if they're okay. And for many people who have not been involved in fighting, that seems bizarre. How could you be trying to punch somebody in the face and then hug them and kiss them on the cheek and hope they're all right? And I think that there is something in here that I want to talk about that many of you may have experienced, which is the closeness you feel to somebody at a very basic level. There is something that you feel after playing a game with them, whether it's just a game of Ultimate in the park or whether it's a pickup game of basketball. There's a certain kind of relationship you have, a certain kind of closeness, a certain kind of knowledge of the other that you can't really get in many other circumstances. Sex maybe being one of them, dancing maybe being another. But for all of you that have played sports and encountered that, you know that feeling of particular kind of closeness that's difficult to replicate. And which is, I think, important for us in thinking socially, And why I use a guy called Jean-Luc Nancy a lot, because he talks a lot about the differentiation between singularities and pluralities. And much of that has to do with the relationship between an individual and the social body. And oftentimes, there are tensions between us and them, tensions between we and the other, and tensions between what constitutes a singularity or an individual and a plurality of a community or of a commonality around us. And much of the way that language, I've got lots of problem with the way that language around community is invoked. When people often talk about the idea of community as a generalized good, but when you're using the word community, you are using language of us. We are a community, and they are not part of our community. There is a particular kind of language, an exclusive kind of language around discourses of community that I find very problematic. And much of those languages then of community, you can extrapolate to, for example, white supremacist movements, other kinds of racist movements. Very clear distinctions between us and them. But I think part of the answer that begins to kind of problematize that and begins to add a little bit of nuance to it is when we can talk about those borders, about permeabilities of borders. And why, for example, when I talk about cities, I always want to talk about neighborhoods. I don't want to talk about communities. Because you don't get to choose who lives beside you in a neighborhood. But in communities, you can. To my mind, neighborhoods have a whole set of inclusivity and a whole set of commitment to difference that community absolutely doesn't. Which is why you can talk about, for example, a gated community. But I think then that there is something in there when we theoretically, and this is why Jean-Luc Nancy is so useful, is to talk about that kind of permeability. To talk about, yes, there's a possibility for commonality, but with borders and edges that are not fixed, i.e. that there's some movement between them and there's some confusion between them. And I think then that's why I would argue for sports being so particularly important for understanding this at a bodily level. Because that permeability of our flesh is enacted constantly in the sporting arena. So of course that there are some limits to my body, particularly my skin. I am a singularity. I'm an individual. My body is my body, and it is not yours. But in other ways, that's entirely untrue. That you know that all of your cells slough off constantly. That I breathe the air that you breathe. I shed skin, I piss, I cry. Water and air passes through me constantly. And the air and the water that passes through my body has passed through your body and countless other kinds of bodies. And I think that oftentimes, when you play sports, those thresholds between the singularity and the plurality, between the I and the we, between exactly where those thresholds lie, become blurred. That oftentimes, that act of that young kid lying on top of me, sweating profusely and rolling around for 45 minutes, my sweat is his sweat, and much of his sweat is in fact in my mouth. And Jean-Luc Nancy has a phrase. He says, and it's kind of one of his signature phrases, he says, there is no existence without coexistence. And he makes a whole lot of theoretical distinctions between the singular and the plural. And I think that in many ways, the time that I have understood that most clearly is when I'm playing sports. So I think, and I'm going to wrap this up, but I think that those are three particular investigations that I've followed, three particular lines of inquiry to try to understand why it is that I'm so convinced that the possibilities of the sporting world are so compelling. Why I think there are possibilities in sports, whether it's playing in the park, whether it's watching games at Roma, that's the old and sadly departed Roma, whether it's watching TV with some buddies, whether it's playing a game in the sport, whether it's attempting to perform at a high level, or whether it's admiring somebody who plays at a professional level. I think at every level, there is something profoundly important about the sporting world that is worth us taking seriously. There is so much awful and gross and reprehensible. But I like you, and I'd like to hope that there are a million ways that we can rethink, we can reshape, and we can rethink this. I think then that there is plenty of reason and plenty of possibility and plenty of locations for us to rethink notions of what sports are, but what sports could and should and might be. And I want to offer you just one last tiny example, and that is of one of my very favorite sports teams, which is the Green Bay Packers. Football team out of Green Bay, Wisconsin, small place. But those of you that will know that Green Bay is the only community-owned sports franchise in North America. Green Bay has 120,000 owners, that it's people you can buy shares in the Green Bay Packers. It is, in fact, operates as a cooperative, and that all the profits from the team go into a nonprofit society that provides sporting and recreational opportunities for youth in the Green Bay area. And you begin to think about that, and you say, yeah, why is that the only team? And the answer is because it's been legislated away because teams are afraid of it, or the leagues are afraid of it. But you have a profoundly important sports franchise that operates in the NFL that, in fact, is socialized. It is a commonly held asset of the community, and its benefits are distributed more or less commonly throughout the municipality. And so I would ask you to consider, just at a basic economic level, if sports are so important to us, even at the professional level, why do the citizens of Vancouver not, for example, own the Vancouver Canucks? For one example. Why, for example, is it perceived that what we perceive that professional sports teams of all kinds are and could and must be owned by individual profiteers? Why can those not be socialized as community assets? And I think the Green Bay Packers, but a whole series of other teams primarily throughout Europe, have demonstrated that that a municipality can own a team and have it compete at the highest level. But I think the last thing I want to do here, and the last thing I want to offer to you, and I think that maybe more important than all of that is that, and I think I've maybe hinted at it, are the possibilities that sport offer for friendship in all kinds of ways. And I'll submit to you, as per Ivan Illich, that in fact there may be, in these times, there may be in fact no more important virtue and no more important kind of relationship to inculcate than that of what Illich called disciplined convivial friendships. And I just want to read to you briefly here. Illich said, "I do not believe that friendship today can come out of political life. I do believe that if there is something like a political life to remain for us in this world of technology, then it begins with friendship. Society will only be as good as the political result of these friendships." And to my mind, and to my experience, and to my hope, that there is no better place to inculcate disciplined convivial friendships than sports. I'm going to stop there. But I'm not quite done. I'm not quite done. Okay. I'm sorry, what's your name back there, Dave? Paul, sorry, Paul. You ready? Okay, you got to start over here. Just that y'all here. Ready? You ever seen a wave before? Ready? Okay. So when I go like this, you're going to put your hands up in the air. Ready, Dave? I'm sorry, Paul. Sorry. Ready? Okay, go. Hands up, hands up, hands up, hands up, hands up, hands up, hands up. Sweet. Okay. Ready? Go. Beautiful. You guys are beautiful. Okay, hold on. Two more things. Ready? Got your ball? Who's got a ball? Okay. There is, in fact, a prize. A very, very fine prize that Celine over there is waiting for you. Ready? Anybody? Just shoot away as you go. I'm coming through. Anybody get? Hold on, there's another one. We got two door prizes. Hold on. Go.
Oh, there's another one.
Who's the other door prize? Last thing, there's one very last thing. There's actually another door prize. Look under your seat. Look under your seat. If you got it, underneath the seat, if there's what is there?
There's a little sign. And then look under the seat next to you, maybe, because I think somebody put a backpack on it. Yeah, you found it.
So the last thing I should have done, but I didn't do, was a 50-50 draw.
Oh, yeah.
I could have made some more money out of this next time, for sure. All right, I appreciate you guys very much being stupid with me. With that for
Yeah, we got time for questions.
Comments, questions? No comments or questions? There you go, sir, please.
Just given what you said, I'm curious about Blair. The city's reticence, although I think that's changed, about accepting MMA and boxing events in our city, which are so popular everywhere else. So maybe you could comment on that.
That's a good question. I think
what you said, I
What's
deeply believe what you said, that I think people in City Hall who often have not been athletic, have not had those experiences, are myopic to the benefits and only see kind of the riot-esque, or they bring it down to the financial widget of what it's going to cost the society as opposed to what it gives the society.
I'm sorry, Blair. I don't really have anything useful to say to you there, except I don't know. I mean, it would be an interesting question to ask Gregor, who ostensibly plays a lot of rugby. I think that the act of people. So I think there's an important argument to be made here about MMA and about boxing not being violence. That in fact, that violence is by definition non-consensual. That in fact, violence is not something that is done between two agreeing people in a ring. Let me give you a quick example, and I write about this in the book a little bit, which is that there's a famous story about a guy called Emil Griffith, who will show up here sometime. Emil Griffith was a boxer in the 1950s, a beautiful and an incredibly skilled middleweight boxer who essentially everybody knew was gay. And a guy called Benny Perret, who was a Cuban boxer, taunted him before one of their championships. They had a trilogy of fights. Incredibly brutal fights in many ways. But Benny Perret taunted Emil Griffith, called him American a whole bunch of times, and taunted him because he was first he was incredibly beautiful, but he was also the fact of his gayness was fairly open. And essentially in the ring in Madison Square Garden, Emil Griffith killed him. His trainer Gil Clancy said, "Keep punching and don't stop punching until the ref pulls you off him." And the argument has been that because he was so angry about being taunted for so long by Benny Perret, he had a certain kind of power that he wouldn't have had otherwise. My argument would be that, in fact, that was not violence. That, in fact, in the context of the ring, that what Emil Griffith did was not violence. The fact that he punched after the bell was violence. And what Perret did to him by calling him names was, in fact, violence as well. It's a tricky distinction, I think, but I would say but of course that we should abhor non-consensual violence in all its forms. But that I think the argument needs to be made that MMA and boxing are not violence. And in fact, there are other kinds of social violence that are much more pervasive. I don't think that answers your question, but it's a comment. Yeah, sorry, sir.
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, in the back. with a good aim over here. First of all, thank you so much. That was really insightful, and I feel very transformed through this talk. So thank you so much. Second of all, I really enjoyed your analogy about the arts and what you had to say there. But I would actually have to say that I disagree with you. I believe that there is a mass movement by both, first of all, the conservative government, but also our provincial government to get people shifted away from the arts. And anyways, it was just a point of disagreement.
The fact that people valorize the arts, is that what you're...
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's actually true, except that I guess I'm arguing with particular sectors that would argue that, for example, art is valuable and interesting and ennobling and sports is for lugnuts. I'm just trying to break that distinction up some way. But I think you're correct. I think the idea that somehow that the arts are universally valorized, I think is not true. Yeah, I accept that. Yeah. Anybody else comment?
Right.
Rob, you got something?
You talked at the outset about the many ways capitalism maims sport. And I think one of the ways is it makes it, this is going to sound weird, the hyper-competition seeps into it. And so we teach it to kids like they're all going to be pros. And I think one of the ways that we can maybe key in on the difference and the creativity is to teach that to kids early on. Wait.
Yeah, no, I think there's a bunch of stuff in there around competition, right? And I think that there's a way that we can cast competition as mutually supportive and an exercise of solidarity, not of domination. And we know what that feels like. You know when you're playing a game of hockey and you know that guy is trying to kill you and you're like, what is going on with that guy? What is wrong with that guy? That's not what I came out here to play. And you know what it's like when you play hard, you play aggressive, you're in each other's face, but you know they're supportive. It's a very different distinction between that. And I think there's subtle differentiations between how we cast competition. I'm wholly in favor of competition. I am completely not in favor of domination in any sense. But I also think there's something interesting there about, do you remember that film Hoop Dreams? And there's this argument, the film was about, followed two young kids in Chicago who were trying to become professional athletes. And essentially they both failed. One guy kind of more so than the other. And there was this argument that kind of was inherited through the movie that, if you play basketball your whole life and then you don't become pro, you failed. It was a mistaken exercise. And I think that's a total fallacy. I think that it's not a career move. We're not playing sports because of it's a portfolio. Everybody knows that you're unlikely to make the NHL, you're unlikely to make the NBA. And you don't say, well, my God, you spent your entire time playing the trumpet. Look at you can't make any money from the trumpet. That's a waste of time. You wasted your childhood. That in fact we play, I played basketball my entire childhood and I thought I was downtown Freddie Brown and I imagined that I was going to be a pro, but really in my heart I knew I wasn't. Does that mean I wasted my time? I think reconceptualizing or positing playing games as somehow part of a career move, I think is a total fallacy and is the way that adults try to then justify kids' joy and love of playing rather than thinking of it as joyful in and of itself. And I think that, I guess part of my argument too around the maiming of sports by capitalism is true that look at everything. Try to go to a dance event without there being cigarette ads all over it. Try to go, what part of our social lives or our cultural lives is capitalism not maimed? Yes, sports may be more profoundly and more aggressively and more, sort of kind of a more volatile way than most other aspects, but my argument would be because it's so powerful, because there's so many people who are so interested. But I would say that that's an anti-capitalist argument, not an anti-sports argument.
Hey,
Travis.
Sorry, I don't think I'll be able to voice this eloquently, but one of the questions that I had kind of revolves around dangers, and especially sports like action sports. Is just over a month ago now, Andreas Francis and J.P. Auclair and Liz Daly, 3 really big backcountry skiers and snowboarders, died on the same day in different avalanches in Chile. And I'm wondering how the dangers of those kind of sports, and especially more individual pursuits in that, affect maybe the creativity of those sports, the regulations, and even the outcomes that you've talked about today.
I don't think I'm going to answer your question properly, except to say that's a really interesting territory. And I've been a gigantic football fan my whole life. I love football. It's like the perfect thing to watch on television. It's a great television sport. The damage that people are doing to themselves, that young men are doing to themselves, I really don't care about. The fact that they can't walk, their shoulders are popped out, that they're sore, I'm fine with that. What I'm not fine with is the concussions. I've had a bunch of concussions myself, and there's this spate of young men who are, it's not just, and those of you that have had a bad concussion know that it's not just you get dinged up or whatever. It's different. It's the depression. It's the anger management issues. It's just the sheer sadness. And the number of NFL players who many of you have read about who have CTE, which is essentially your brain gets holes in it at a young age. And the number of young NFL players who have shot themselves in the chest. And they shoot themselves in the chest because they know there's something wrong with their brain and they want someone to check it out. You know about Andre Waters. You know about Dave Duerson. You know about Junior Seau. These are young men, my age, who shot themselves in the chest because they want someone to look at their head and they say, I know there's something wrong with my brain. And the only way you can test for CTE is by doing these kind of like salami slices after you're dead. And I'm really struggling with the concussions. And I cannot say that I feel good or settled about it. And I can imagine a time when I don't watch football anymore and I renounce football because of it. That said, I think that there are dangers inherent in every activity. And so football is certainly dangerous. Boxing is dangerous. MMA is dangerous. But so is mountain climbing. So is backwoods skiing. And part of that adoption and that attraction to risk is part of it, right? And I think that there are consequences of all our activities. And is it more dangerous to, for example, go backwoods skiing than it is to, say, work in a demeaning, dispiriting job where you suck hope and energy and you've got all kinds of physical diseases because of your immobility? there are consequences to all stuff, and to all kinds of activities. And when they're entered in consensually, I have no problem with it. There are larger constructs around that, which are to say there are actually other kinds of social violence that impel people to, for example, do risky activities like boxing, which is to say people are, young kids are so poor that they can't see any other particular lines of income generation for themselves. And I would say that is a particular kind of social violence that is inherited by capitalism that I think is much more violent than, say, for example, taking a punch to the face. That's kind of a mixed up answer, but I'm in the territory, I think. Yeah. We got time for more? Yeah. Yes, sir, please.
I was just wondering if, tying into your comment about capitalism, if you could comment on sports sort of being symbolic, sort of emotionally and culturally of militarism and the sort of military-industrial complex. In my opinion, sort of sports fandom frequently overlaps or touches the same nerve as sort of patriotism and militarism and whatnot. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sorry, I didn't catch your name, sir.
Gurpreet.
Thanks, man. Yeah, no, absolutely. There's all kinds, and you go to a freaking NFL game and they're singing the national anthem and they got Marines coming out and there's warplanes flying overhead, and absolutely. And I think that conflation of aggressive militaristic patriotism with the sporting world, I think, is indicative of the left's incapacity to offer a compelling narrative otherwise. That in fact, much of that, there's nothing particular about a sporting activity. I think I could make an easy argument that you might buy around solidarity, around cooperation, around teamwork, that in fact have nothing to do with that kind of obnoxious patriotism and militarism. I think that ground has been captured, of course, by the political right for all kinds of really valuable and really fecund reasons. But I don't think that's necessarily so. I think absolutely we need to decry that kind of militarization of the sporting and the cultural world. But I don't think that's necessarily endemic or symptomatic of sports itself. I think it's of a larger, highly militaristic, highly aggressive, highly patriotic culture. Yeah, that's what I got. There's more to it than there, but except to say agree with it and decry it and say that, I think that's symptomatic of something other than inherently sporting activity. I think that we could talk about, people say, well, people act like warriors on a battlefield or whatever. And I say, well, okay, maybe, but maybe they look like workers in a cooperative too. I think those metaphors are contested. I don't think those are given metaphors. Sorry, sir, go ahead, man.
What your discussion raises for me, and it's been a long time since I read this, but Bruce Kidd had written his thesis on sort of the fact that, like, say, 100 years ago, there would have been a system of sports teams organized through unions, and lots of people spent their free time in sports and in activities that that were organized and cooperative. And then over the last 100 years, there's been a sort of a slow sort of that's completely changed. I know when I've done a lot of work around hockey in the 30s, and so Conn Smythe, that was his idea, was that we'd keep men. Conn Smythe was the first owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs. That the reason for sports was to keep men in shape and in a warlike setting in times of peace, so that they'd be ready when the next war came around. So just wondered if you can comment on that.
And that's actually true in lots of cases. There's all kinds of other renditions of that in Europe particularly. Think about, watch a Barcelona soccer game, and the Barcelona soccer team is so bound up with Catalan independence movement, it's almost impossible to disembed it. But there's a great tradition of that. And if you ever get a chance, the best book ever written about sports, I would guess, is a book by Eduardo Galeano called Soccer in Sun and Shadow. Fantastic book. Galeano is as big a sports fan as there is. And it's great, kind of elegiac and kind of nostalgic book, but talks about that particularly, about Uruguayan unions and about South American soccer and unions being bound up.
Maybe you have time for 2 more questions.
You want to hit it, Blair? Blair?
Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, just super quick. I mean, I teach at high school, and it's Remembrance Day, and Wilfred Owen's poem that ends, in my Latin's terrible, Delcate cora mes por patria more, and I just think, it's not well and good to tell kids that it's great to die for your country, and it was about the mustard gas. We all kind of studied that in school, but it just tells me that at the time, whoever are in power used the mechanisms of communication to get people, either through sports or patriotism, just as you were saying, young men to sort of buy into this. And of course, back then it was poetry, and now it's, whatever mediums are more expedient for doing it.
That's a really interesting comment. Thanks, man. So I guess the fact of that just says nothing particular about poetry. Right. We got time for one more? Anybody else? One more comment? Yeah, hit him, man. It's Ian, right? Yeah, Ian. Sorry, Ian.
I guess the place that this naturally goes for me is how do you uncouple capitalism from sports, or how do you, if sports is totally fucked by this, how do you unfuck it? Yeah. So, next question. I think actually, you're gonna kill me for this, but I say that's exactly the right place to end. I think that's a super interesting question, except to say that perhaps maybe you'll take my argument that there is something so important about sports that we can't lose track of it. There's something so powerful and so unique about the sporting arena that it's worth fighting for. I have a few answers to that question, but I don't think anything's articulate at this time. I'm sorry, man. But that's actually a good lead-in to say, why don't we call it there? I got to go somewhere first thing tomorrow morning, but if anybody wants to go have a beer briefly, I could totally happily sit around and talk about sports with anybody who wants to hang out or talk about anything else.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, you guys.